Hi, it's Dr. Noel Williams, Optimal Health Associates, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. August 13th, COVID update. So, it's a confusing time. I mean, I think it's all fairly hard to take in, synthesize, and cognate directions on. So, I'll do my best. So, the first thing is the United States has kind of had a sudden increase, and we're at about 100,000 cases. The Delta variant is definitely hitting here. Everyone knows that it's really booming in Florida and Arkansas relatively, and Texas, but really all across the country. But it's really booming predominantly in the unvaccinated. In terms of serious illness, we are not seeing very much serious illness at all in people with prior vaccination. And you're really not hearing anything about people with prior infection getting it. When we just look at our anecdotal experience, which is just ours in my practice, which is very busy, we've had 60 new infections in the last 2.5 weeks, which is probably more than most practices. And so what we break that into groups: vaccinated, unvaccinated, and prior infected. We had our first true prior infected person positive yesterday. We've had about a split of 30-30 in both of the other two groups. But notably, the person who is infected again is very minor symptoms, and virtually, or most of the prior vaccinated have had reasonably mild symptoms. We did have 2 people with prior vaccination go get monoclonal antibodies because they were kind of breaking through their initial treatment. The rest didn't. We've had a bunch of pretty much all the unvaccinated. We recommend the monoclonal antibodies to because they are sick already. Now, not all of them get it, but we do the order and send it in, and people can go to Deaconess and some other places. So anyway, a big thank you to Integris for having that up and running. Big thank you to some of my task force members who give different perspectives and are doing tons of research. David Chansom, thank you for spending time going over a variety of different subjects last week and what's going on in the Archdiocese and the school programs and all the hard work everybody's doing there. Thank you to Julie Watson, as always, Cameron Manter at OU, and then Julie is at Integris, and then Carl Ruskowski for some recent updates. So what's going on with Delta, I think Dr. Ruskowski had some, from different things he's watched and read, that the Delta pulse in England and India seems to have been about a month and seems to be dying down, which makes sense immunologically because it's running through predominantly the unvaccinated, and then once it whips through that population, it has a tendency not to have that much humph or oomph or something, whatever word I'm looking for, left, because the vaccinated are fairly immune to it or minimally get infected and probably are not spreading it that much, and it's probably going to look like the same with the previously infected. So maybe there's some opportunity, since it's come up so fast, that maybe it's going to be like that here, and it will come and go in the next 4 to 6 weeks, and it won't be the projection that it's going to peak in October. So I think I'm tentatively leaning that way too. I think that's very wise science and counsel from some very smart people that we need to potentially think this is going to boom and bust, which would be nice. Then in terms of Oklahoma, we had a little under 2,000 cases the last few days. The hospitals and the ICUs are pretty filled up with COVID patients, but again, we have a great group of people working on them. So that's kind of the COVID Delta update. In terms of vaccinations, again, vaccines save lives. I want everyone over 18 to get vaccinated, and I'm really leaning towards the 15 to 18-year-old group to get vaccinated too now. And there's a variety of reasons why. The rapidity of the viral reproduction in the cells and then the potential ramifications for people is the data is pointing towards younger people getting sicker. Now, it has not been elementary school kids or middle school kids so far, really high school kids, but we're definitely seeing the age bracket coming down to who's getting really sick. We had a 33-year-old out of Shawnee die this week this last few days who was completely healthy. And there was another 31 that was reported not in the Oklahoma area, again, very, very healthy, who died pretty quickly with COVID. Again, pretty shocking when that's happening, and that's one of the things with this. And so as we're seeing this shift into the 20s, we start to worry a little bit about the late teens. And so definitely over 18, I would strongly encourage everyone to get the vaccine. 15 to 18, I think it's starting to be a little bit stronger consideration. And again, the data is early, but the problem we're having is, we don't want to wait too long and have these kids get suddenly sick and then lose some, when the vaccine definitely looks, I have no worries about the vaccine for acute stuff. I'm just worried about the vaccine. My only issue with the messenger RNA vaccines is not knowing long term. And so as we start looking at that, we're not going to know about these for 10 or 12 years. We do know the messenger RNA is rinsed out in about 45 days from the vaccine date. So you put that in mind compared to the viral infection with the Delta, where there's a much greater viral load and effect on the body. And I start to wonder if that effect on the bone marrow and clearing it in the immune system isn't going to actually be greater than the vaccine, because the vaccine has a less intensive reaction in the body than Delta. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing, and why people can get rapidly sick, is Delta is a different and more aggressive beast immunologically and infectiously. So I'm beginning to have a lot more concern about the Delta effect in these late teens than I would be with the vaccine, which is a change for me. But again, I'm thinking about this constantly, talking to this with people constantly who are very smart, and trying to analyze what's best, which is hard. The under 15-year-old group, 14 and under, it's really hard to find substantial risk for them at all. If you look at the data that's coming out of all the children's hospitals, from touching base with some of the people today at Children's, they're seeing a lot of RSV hospital admissions right now. They are not seeing very many COVID across the country, especially in kids under 14. It's scant. So that's very reassuring. There's one exception, that's Arkansas, which we don't have an explanation for, but the rest of the country is pretty uniformly not, and I'll have actually the published data on that for tomorrow, which I'll post. So that's kind of the summary. Sorry I can't always tell you the best thing to do. I'm doing what I can, but with these vaccines in younger people, it's just a really tough subject for all of us. Now, for anyone else, zinc, vitamin D, fish oil, a multivitamin, all the standard stuff we talked about. Do your zinc at least 3 times a week. Okay, Kim has questions for me. She's back from Crested Butte.
One of them was the vitamin regimen. So you just mentioned everything except melatonin.
Oh, melatonin. Sorry, yeah. The melatonin stops the interleukin inflammatory cascade. I'm sorry, my phone's ringing. I'm just very popular. Oh, Dr. Ruskowski just texted me to watch the Z-Dog MD Facebook post. That was what he was referencing. And it says, adios Delta. And Z-Dog goes over very nicely the theory that it should come and go quickly. So again, a very reasonable podcast to watch from a guy who's come a long way from the beginning, where he thought a lot of this was a little different than I did, and now he's kind of come full circle and can't stand Fauci, the NIH, or any of these people, and thinks a lot of what's happened is crap. But anyway, so melatonin, anywhere between 1 and 5 milligrams.
Okay. I think I told you, people are thinking that you're recommending the Pfizer vaccine over others because of your last post.
I didn't mean it like that. Kim wasn't here, so I was doing everything on my own. So I just did a couple of hashtags, and I put hashtag Pfizer and forgot to put hashtag Moderna and hashtag J&J. So that's all it was. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are very equivalent. The J&J is weaker on the Delta. The J&J I don't encourage for girls, because it's a 1 in a million documented risk for a blood clot event, and it's probably more frequent than that. It's just that's what's the clinically documented. So that does not seem to be happening with the messenger RNA ones. So I'm a little less on board with J&J for girls who are reproductive age. But again, my 28-year-old got the J&J. My 19-year-old got the Pfizer. What did Noel get? He got the Moderna or the Pfizer. I can't remember. They all kind of blend. So I think any of them are fine, but if you're a girl, I'd stay away from the J&J. And we can't really tell when some of these other ones are going to come out.
Okay. So there were several comments from people that have had COVID in the past that are upset, not necessarily with you, but just in general, with being lumped in with the unvaccinated.
I hope you're not upset with me. I'm the person who said that if you had gotten infected, you were immune. And I continue to feel that way. I mean, I base that on common sense immunology. That's been the standard with viral infections for the last, 80 years or something, or 90 years. Two, we look at the NIH, or National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, Dr. Andrew Redd's study that showed that vaccinated or infected people had long-term T-cell immunity. Number two, we look at the Journal of Science article, which is one of many, but the definitive one, that they have long-term B-cell immunity. Third, you look at Fauci's own emails that said that people had, back from last year, that were released and said people have long-term immunity if they get it. Four, we look at the incidence of recurrent infections across the world with all the variants has been scant, and so far with the Delta it remains very, very scant in terms of reports. So I think we can feel very comfortable that infected people are very unlikely to get, prior infected people are very unlikely to get infected, which I've said 800,000 times against everybody else's opinion. And remember, where did the Pfizer data and the Moderna data and the J&J data and the AstraZeneca data come from? How did they build their vaccines? They took a very small number in these studies, usually somewhere around 30, of prior infected people, and drew their convalescent or recovering plasma antibody levels to the S1 receptor binding domain for the spike protein antigen, the antibody to that. And they looked at the average amount, and that's the mean. And so then what they did is they developed a vaccine dose to match the mean antibody response in the vaccinated to the mean antibody response in the infected. And they said, if you get this, you're immune. So by definition, since the control group that are immune are the infected, they're immune. The control immunity group is the infected. In every vaccine trial, that was the gold standard to compare to. So you have to be immune. It's just a matter of, are you as immune against the Delta as the vaccinated? It's looking like yes, and probably more. But again, I don't have a paper to prove that yet. But that's where we're all coming from. And as I mentioned, I think at my last post or two, France is the only country that I can find that recognizes prior infection as equivalent to vaccination. But I can't fix that either, because I mean, the NIH, NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and the FDA, and every umbrella medical group in the United States won't recognize that, even though the papers, the journal articles on the vaccines, all is based on that. But what can I do? I can't do anything.
So you kind of addressed this, but I'll go ahead and ask it. Are our hospitals overwhelmed with COVID patients?
Our hospitals are overwhelmed, somewhat because of the COVID patients, but mostly because of the nursing shortage. The nursing shortage is killing the hospitals and physicians and respiratory therapists and staff who've been manning the front line against COVID, and along with all the other acute care needs, are crushed. They have PTSD and they're worn out. Be nice to them. And so the extra COVID cases coming down from Northeast Oklahoma is really pretty hard on even our hospitals. But I think all the ICU beds were pretty much full today in the entire state, and there's a very limited availability of beds at tertiary care facilities.
Okay. How do you feel about ultraviolet light in classrooms? Is that helpful?
So ultraviolet light, that's a great question, by the way. So we know that if you're outside for 7 minutes, the sun, the original source of ultraviolet light, just remember, it's the sun, kills COVID in your mouth or your nose in 7 minutes. So having ultraviolet light in a classroom, definitely, that's one of the ways. There's two ways that they've cleaned rooms without like an alcohol thing. It's either an ozonator, putting ozone into the room, or using an ultraviolet light. I'm fine with if some mechanistic way of doing that. I don't know how you would do it, or how you have to just flip the light around not to bug anybody's eyes or something, but I'm sure that's very doable.
Okay.
Great question.
Are the death stats up with the Delta variant?
Yes, they've started to come up just a little, but it's early. We'll have a better idea in the next 2 weeks. But I'll tell you, there are definitely more one-off young people dying than I've heard of before in reports, and it's again very concerning. And it's the rapidity of the reproduction, and if it goes awry on you, it's a problem.
Would you recommend getting the vaccine during pregnancy?
The American College of OBGYN recommends getting the vaccine if you're prior to pregnancy or during pregnancy. We do know that people who get COVID during pregnancy have a higher rate of miscarriage in the first trimester and potentially thrombosis to the blood vessels of the placenta, and maybe they themselves can get a higher risk of blood clot over their already elevated risk. And we also know there's a little bit greater risk of disease event with COVID. So the recommendation from the American College of OBGYN is to get vaccinated. I think that's very tough, but I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and I would actually recommend it. I recommend everyone getting vaccinated before they get pregnant, just so you can get it out of the way if you're even thinking about it. But you don't want to get COVID while you're pregnant. You absolutely don't want to get Delta.
So that pretty much answers also if you're going through infertility and not pregnant yet.
Get the vaccine.
Okay.
If you're over 18, you need to get the vaccine. And especially, we're looking at people, 25 to 30% of the hospitalizations are 18 to 33 or something, with the majority being 25 to 33. But some of these people are sick and they're dying. One of these people I talked about, the 31-year-old, died in an ER. He came in and died this weekend in an ER. It's terrible. He'd only been sick for 3 or 4 days. And he didn't have risk factors, and he was healthy. No one could, his family can't believe it. They can't, no one can believe it, but it happens.
What would your recommendation be for somebody whose antibodies are 300 and more? Should they still get vaccinated?
Well, if you look at what the CDC and FDA and NIH says, yes. Now, since I'm always checking antibodies, and that's a good antibody level. If I see that level in someone who's been vaccinated, I'm fine. I had someone's results today who was 4 or 5 months out, and he was at like 430, and I checked mine a week or two ago, and I was at 500, and I'm like, I'm good. So, and I don't think there's that much of a difference between 300 and 500 with that. There's not really a correlate to your vaccine level for things and your immune response, as long as you're positive, and that's a strong positive at 300.
Well, that might have been confusing. Was the person?
Yeah, that was confusing.
Well, was the person?
I did it on purpose that way because it's a controversial subject.
Was the person that you were talking about, had he been vaccinated?
He'd been vaccinated. Okay. So he wanted to make sure he was immune because he's on. So I had a gentleman who's older. He wanted to check his vaccine status. We talked about, because he's on immunosuppressants for an inflammatory bowel disease. So we checked, and he was at 430. I checked mine the week before just because I wanted to make sure. I don't know, you get worried, and mine were 500. And so I'm like, that's a really good level. And I don't think there's a difference between 300 and 500. And again, as the papers have talked about, the number is less important than the actual immune response, because your antibodies can fade and you still have immunity, which we've talked about.
So I think that was more a question of, if I've had COVID and my antibodies are 300 plus, should I get the vaccine?
Yes. Not yes to the question. I understand that, yes. So then we could see if your levels will go to 2,500. But does that make you feel better? And I can tell you from some of the people who got the vaccine, who now have antibodies over 2,500, some of them have not felt good because they've inflamed so much. And I don't think we know if that really is all that much better clinically than 300 because you're immune. You have an immune response.
So I'm going to keep
So-
going
so-
on this one because you said yes, and that was confusing.
No, I didn't mean yes. I meant yes to the question in terms of, yes, I'm trying to answer it, not yes,
Okay.
I'd go get a vaccine. That's my whole point.
Okay, so I'm going to ask it again. If you've had COVID and your antibodies are 300 or 300 more, would you recommend getting the vaccine right now?
I wouldn't, but I'm going against all the everybody else's opinion. But I mean, one, like if I had someone today in who's like 6 months out and has long haul syndrome, I absolutely am not going to encourage her to get the vaccine. In fact, I checked her antibodies today, and I'm writing her an exemption for the vaccine because she's symptomatic still from COVID. So, but I'm going to document that her antibodies are up. But again, the antibody I'm checking, to be specific and not to be quibbled with by any people at all, is the exact same antibody that they checked for the AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J vaccine level of antibody to show immunity. So I'm doing the exact one, so I can say if this antibody matches this range, it is highly likely you are 95% immune.
Okay. You've talked in the past about the MMR and the Tdap giving cross immunity for COVID. Does that count for Delta too?
We don't know. We do not know if it counts for for Delta. We think it probably does, but we don't know, so we don't know. Delta's a different animal, so that's why we have to be a little more conservative and look at that 15 to 18-year-old group for vaccination.
Are all testing sites testing variants?
No, it's really kind of testing sites like when we do tests at our office right now, because we're doing some, we're not testing for variants, we're just testing for COVID. So some state-run sites are, and they'll get swabs referred in from other places to look, but it's kind of random.
Okay. Why can't you get vaccines in your primary care offices?
Oh, the reason it's hard to get a vaccine at like our office and some of the other offices is just the paperwork load of getting certified, which has gotten a little easier, but it's just logistically tough. It's just a hard process. And if you're like we are, where I have 1, 2, 3, well, Dr. Smith, Dr. Berenberg, Fong Dang, Cassie's PA, and then my 7, 10, 11 with 11 providers and, you know, over 1,000, 1,200 patient visits a week. It's really hard to be figuring out logistics for all that stuff. So, but people can get one at the City County Health Department or a variety of the Integris or Mercy clinics or OU or anywhere by making a phone call. Okay, so that was long, sorry. Anyway, take care. I rambled. Best of luck to all of you. Bye.